The time for talk is over. Justice will be served.
He only sat because his leg was talking again, the kind of dull fire that snuck up the bone and made standing feel like leaning into wind. The bench in front of the courthouse was concrete, too low and too cold, but it was level. He put his pack under his knees and folded his hands over the bill of his cap. People came and went, heels clicking, phones glowing. Clean collars and coffee end. He folded himself smaller. Small enough to be a shadow in the shape of a man. "Move along," a guard said. "No, sir. No, please." Just two flat words. He lifted his head and took in the uniform, the badge, the mirroring sunglasses. The guard didn't look at him, not really. The man hooked his pack with 2 fingers, stood with a wince he didn't name, and adjusted the faded cap over his brow. "You can't loiter here," the guard added, glancing at the passers-by, as if explaining a policy everyone already knew. A young mother tugged her son closer. Courier in a lime jacket veered around. "Him like a puddle, understood," the man said. His voice was low and even, the voice that had once cut through wind and smoke. He stepped aside, left foot careful, right leg dragging just a half beat. The limp you wouldn't notice until you stared. He didn't point out the paper in his pocket, the one that told him to be here. He didn't say anything at all. Not about the night he had nowhere else to sit, the warning they'd left under the bridge, the fines, and the language of trespass. He moved because he'd been told to move, because there was no shelter in explanation. Because it was easier to carry a bruise in silence. No one stopped him. No one said sorry in the glass of the courthouse doors. He was only a smudge sliding by. He woke with the first buses and the pigeons, the city stirring into itself. The awning behind the barber shop leaked in a clean line down the brick. He'd learned to place his roll just to the left of it. At dawn, he packed everything he owned into a canvas rucksack, older than the hole in his sock, cinched the strap around his chest, and stood until the ache in his ankle settled into something like cooperation. There was a routine. He liked routines because they had edges. He rinsed his face in the public restroom at the park where the water ran too hot in summer and too cold in winter, cupping it in his hands and blinking through the sting. He wiped his boots with a paper towel, a habit that felt like sweeping. A porch. He tucked the only photo he kept to smaller him with a bigger smile, deeper into the spine of an old paperback. On good mornings, the church kitchen on Stanton would serve oatmeal so thick your spoon stood like a flag. On lean mornings, there was a vending machine coffee and a stale cinnamon roll he broke into careful halves. One for now, one for later. Ate alone, he always had. Even when he hadn't. Because eating alone was a way to spare everyone the work of small talk. He took his food to the far edge of benches, 2 curbs, to the low wall by the bus depot where pigeons strutted like inspectors. He chewed slowly, watching traffic carry lives around him that had nothing to do with his own. When he walked with his shoulders square and his chin level, an old drill that stuck, that kept his spine from folding into itself. The limp made him slow but not soft. He turned his foot to avoid the cracks, not because he believed in the superstition, but because predicting the uneven kept him whole. He wore a cap the color of dust. The stitching at the front had once spelled something in eagle, a number, a piece of a name, but it had gone the way of color in the sun. Inside the cap, under the band, was a coin. Just a challenge coin, just metal with an emblem barely legible from years of skin and sweat, but he liked the weight of it. It reminded him the head had been his once too. If people looked, they saw. A man folding in on middle age, given over to bone and weather. They saw the limp, the cap, the coat too warm for the day, and the backpack too heavy for a short walk. They didn't see the habits baked into his hands the way his fingers counted 8 steps without thinking. The rhythm of his breath when a bus backfired, the stillness he wore, like a jacket when something loud broke the air. They didn't see the history because history makes an odd sound in the throat. It's not something strangers hear. He had a folded paper in his pocket laddering. Again, a ticket tall enough to make him laugh if he'd been in a laughing life. Appear at the Hall of Justice, Department C, at 10 a.m., it was not a drama, not for him. He'd appeared before judges the way he'd appeared before commanding officers. Stand straight. That's where the question asked. Say yes and no, and nothing else. He wasn't worried the way the others in line were worried, not because he felt shielded, but because worry had run. So hot in him once it had burned itself into a quiet caution, he finished the last of his coffee, wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve as discreetly as a man could, and set off toward the courthouse. He counted the walk-in blocks, not in minutes. He nodded at the man who swept his stoop on Jefferson, at the woman who watered her planter by the pawn shop. Neither looked up. He adjusted the strap on his pack and let the city swallow him its usual way. The courthouse looked like every courthouse he'd ever seen, glass and stone, and the kind of shining floors that smelled faintly of lemons. Security at the door funneled people into lines, belts and keys clinking into plastic trays. He stepped behind a man in a tie who checked his watch like it owed him something. The guard at the end of the belt wore a bored face. The bored faces were always the hardest. It's anger you can meet, boredom you can't. Backpack, the bored guard said. He lifted it, held it out. Got a hearing slip, he said. Voice didn't ask for anything. You can't take that in. No bags. He nodded once. Is there a locker? He asked. Because asking is on the list before arguing, and he didn't argue. Full, the guard said without looking. Leave it out here. It's everything he owned in a canvas sack, and the suggestion was to lay it on a public bench, like bread for birds. He swallowed, slow and steady. He had two choices. Go back to the street with a problem that wouldn't go away, or leave his world in plain view and pray to a God who had bigger things to monitor. He slid the pack toward the wall, wedged it behind a faded ficus, and made his peace with the risk the way he'd made peace with hundreds of risks he didn't get to choose. Next, the guard said. He could smell the man's aftershave over the cleaner. He emptied his pockets into the tray. Keys that didn't fit doors anymore, folded summons, 3 quarters and a dime. The coin he kept under his cap, he left where it was, preferring the feel of it near his temple to the indignity of dropping it into a dish like a token belt. He unthreaded it, the leather soft in his hands from years of use. His pants sagged uncomfortably, and he lifted a hip to tighten them. A second guard, younger, leaned toward the older one. You smell that? He stage whispered. Can't shower stink off with cologne, the older said, loud enough. A woman behind him made a face, as if the smell had touched her personally. He took off his boots. Sock on his right foot had a crescent shape missing. Near the big toe, he curled his foot under. The younger guard clucked his tongue in a rhythm meant to hurry him. When the scanner whined, because scanners always whine for men with screws in their bones, he lifted his arms without being told, pose drilled into him by a different kind of machine. Wand, 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 it over the hip where metal anchored old. Pain over the ankle, where a plate answered with a muted beep. What's this? The younger guard said. Hardware, he answered. From a break, he didn't say where. He didn't say why. He didn't say the metal sang in the cold and ached in the rain, and that once, in a valley where the wind cut differently. A medic had said, hold still, brother, with a voice softer than anything else in that long day. Those stories are too big to fit into security lines. Spread your legs, the guard said. It wasn't the words, it was the weight on them. He spread his legs until balance threatened. Arms out, back straight, eyes forward. He knew how to be a body someone else arranged. The guard's hands were perfunctory and impatient. He slapped at his pockets as if annoyance could sift through cloth. You can't bring that in, elder guard said, nodding at the table. A small pocket knife lay by the summons, the blade folded in its home, the handle worn smooth. It had belonged to a man who'd taught him how to gut fish with hands like weathered, leather, and a voice that never rose above a low tide. He'd kept it through 4 apartments in 2 states and a handful of catastrophes that hit like storms. It's sentimental, he said. The word felt fancy in his mouth. Not my problem, the guard said, and pointed with his chin to a bin of contraband that looked like a graveyard of everyday talismans. Lighters. Clippers, a metal comb with teeth bent into surrender. He didn't argue. He touched the knife with the pad of his thumb, pressed until he felt its edge in the tiniest way, and then set it in the bin as if laying down a piece of himself he couldn't afford. His face showed nothing. Only his eyes changed. Just a degree, a shutter closing to hide a room that hurt inside. The air conditioned itself into a season that suited no one. He found a bench along the far wall and sat with his hands on his knees, hat in his lap. A mother tugged her boy away without looking back. The boy looked back. Eyes meet quietly sometimes. He winked at the child and then straightened like he. Haddon. Don't sleep, a security supervisor said, passing. She didn't slow down. She just let the words fall like a sign. He nodded at her back. Mr. Cole? A woman in a suit that had seen better chairs and cheaper dry cleaners stopped in front of him. She smelled of coffee and paper. Public defender's office, she said, offering a hand she knew he wouldn't shake, not because he was rude, but because he was careful. He shook it anyway. Her hand was small and dry and firm. We're on Department C, but they moved you to 3B happens all the time. He stood, yes, ma'am. You're charged with trespass and loitering, she said. Judge mostly. Gives time served, sometimes a small fine. We'll ask for community service or a dismissal, okay? Any priors? Parking tickets, he said. It was almost a joke. Her eyes slid over him, not unkind, but mapping the ways to shepherd him through a system that ate its own. Military? She asked softly, like someone who'd learned that word mattered. He tipped his head. Branch? Army. He left it. There, the rest of it was an enormous tree. Names, numbers, places like notches on a trunk. She nodded. Thank you, she said, and her voice turned private for a half-second in the crowded hall. Okay, let's get you in there. You'll have to remove the cap. He took it off. Underneath, the hair was clipped close and scarred in a line. That would be invisible to a stranger unless the light caught it. The cap left a red groove along his forehead, mark he smoothed with 2 fingers. Move, buddy, someone behind them huffed, late for their own problem, stepped aside, shoulders square, letting the tide flow around him. It was the same in every kind of room, people in a rush to get to the part where they'd be made to wait, in the hallway's far corner. The 2 guards leaned together, whispering. The younger one flicked his eyes toward him and smirked. Courthouse. Isn't a shelter, he said to nobody and everybody. The words drifted over marble. People heard them and pretended they didn't. He did what he always did when faced with disrespect that wasn't even about him. He moved on. The metal coin. Under his hat's band made a small, cool press against his temple as if to say, steady. They walked to 3B. The limp forced a rhythm, a slow downbeat. A careful offbeaten. He matched it to his breath. He didn't complain. Not to the defender, not to the building, not to the invisible audience that loves a man who protests and hates a man who just bears up. Complaints had never moved bullets or softened orders. He had learned to put weight where weight belonged, and the next step carried as well as it could be. Sorry about the runaround, the defender said, opening the heavy door with a groan of hinges. Courtrooms like to play musical chairs. Happens, he said. Look, in there, the less we say the better. Yes, Your Honor, and no, Your Honor. I'll do the talking. I know, he said. The words came out in a tone meant for Chain. Of command, respect, not fear. He stood while she found them a place in the second row. He sat only when she did. He held his cap in both hands, fingers resting on the soft brim, thumbs aligned. He didn't turn it, didn't fidget. He looked at the seal on the wall and let his eyes blur so he didn't have to see the room seeing. He knew people were looking. People always look when something doesn't fit. Kept his back straight, chin parallel to the floor, heels under his knees. It's funny the postures that stick from a younger body. How honor can become a habit you keep once everything else is ash. The bailiff, square in the shoulders in a way that told its own story, frowned at him the way men frown at what makes them uneasy. Remove headwear, he called across the room, to nobody in particular. Already in his hands, the cap felt heavier, adjusted it to his knee. The bailiff's eyes flicked to the scar along his hairline and then away, as if seeing cost something he wasn't willing to pay.
Ah!
The man didn't blame him.
Seeing always costs
Somewhere behind him, a clerk shuffled papers with legislative importance. The murmur of the room folded into the low thrum of HVAC. The defender whispered updates about the judge's mood, about a docket gone too long. He nodded, but his attention had narrowed the way it did when waiting for word from the other end of a radio. Patience is not passive. It's a stored electricity. He knew how to hold a charge like that without burning himself from the inside. When his name wasn't called right away. When an hour turned into something longer and his ankle began to twinge the way old weather tells you what's coming, he didn't shift in his seat. He let the pain slide alongside the breath, past the ribs, down into the floor, where he put everything he couldn't carry for long. A young man 2 rows up was called for an assault. A woman to his left whispered that the judge was harsh on shoplifters. Lives rose and fell in short formal sentences. The gavel tapped the end of one thing and the beginning of another. He waited. Waiting had kept him alive more than once. Waiting to move, to speak, to fire. Doesn't argue, doesn't explain. Someone had said about him once, not unkindly. But as if that made him unknowable, he didn't find explanations, changed minds that preferred their first stories. He didn't find arguments settled anything except the dust afterward. He kept his mouth closed, which had been a choice then and was a choice now. When the defender offered to fetch him water, he shook his head gently. When she apologized for the time, it's like this. When the judge is in a mood, he gave the same small tilt. He didn't tilt to be stubborn. He tilted because there was nothing to be sorry about. The machine ran how it ran. At one point, a man in a suit laughed too loud at something his phone had said to him.
The sound cracked.
Air and several heads turned. The man didn't. He'd taught himself a long time ago not to jump at noises. You can teach your body where home is, even if it hasn't had one in a while. All rise. The room scraped up from its benches, the collective shuffle of fabric and friction. He rose slower than he would have once, but the way he rose was the way he always had. Shoulders back, head up, weight evenly distributed to the extent his body allowed it. The judge took the bench, robe hanging heavy, expression neutral in the way of men and women trained not to let faces tell stories. "Good morning," the judge said, voice like wood. "Let's see what we have." The clerk began to read names, case numbers, small tragedies packaged in legal language. When the clerk said, "People v. Harlan James Cole," the judge did what judges do. He looked at the file, looked at the man, looked back at the file. Harlan Cole. The judge said, tasting the syllables carefully, as if he'd found something. In them, he wasn't expecting. His eyes, which had been doing the bureaucratic dance of glancing and moving on, stopped. The public defender stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Colas?" "Give me a moment," the judge said. Eyes climbing from the file to the man's face like someone remembering an old song and trying to catch the first verse. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, softer. "Were you Army?" The room didn't expect that. It leaned forward without meaning to. The man considered the question a split breath and answered the way he always answered questions asked directly and properly. "Yes, Your Honor. Unit." The judge's voice tightened as if reining in. Something that wanted to run. 2-3-2-7, the man said. The numbers came easy. Always would. The 2nd Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne. He didn't add the motto because some things are private in a public way. The judge's mouth opened and then closed. He looked down at the file, at something attached to it, a small note maybe, a report the defender had managed to staple in. A line about prior service scribbled in a different hand. He returned his eyes to the man, to the faded cap in his hands. To the posture, to the scar, a comb couldn't hide. "What was your calcine?" the judge asked. A question no one who didn't know to ask would ever think to ask. "Arrow 3, Charlie," the man said, and the classroom hum of the courtroom went very still. Even the air seemed interested. The judge took off his glasses. His hands were suddenly not the hands of a judge, but the hands of someone remembering cold light. Dust that was as fine as flour and the metal taste of fear. "Petcher," he said, as if testing a word he hadn't said aloud in years. Peck, the man corrected softly. Sir. Not a correction anyone in that room would notice, except the judge. It was not a slight, it was a map. Once, a man grateful for the mercy of accuracy, I was there, the judge said, voice going somewhere it hadn't gone in a long time. As a lieutenant, we were pinned near the canal. We called for anything, anyone. His hands made a small, helpless arc. You stayed on the radio? The man's eyes didn't change? It had already done their changing for the day. We all stayed, he said. The judge stood. Judges don't stand. It's not in their own rooms. The bailiff took a half step. Uncertain. The judge stepped down from the bench because the body wants to be near what the heart is trying to remember. He came to the well of the court, and then halfway to the second row, and then he stopped, as the robe had to be what it was. He raised his right hand to his brow, palm flat, fingers aligned. The salute was crisp, and not because he had kept it in practice, but because some gestures are muscle memory that live even when you've taught yourself to live on a diet of plain reality. It was a soldier's salute, stripped of ornament. It's offered as if the past had opened its door, a crack and light had spilled out. The room made a noise without making a noise. People don't know what to do when hierarchy changes shape in front of them. For a moment, the man didn't move. He stood there with the cap in his hands and the name on his tongue he hadn't said in years. Staff Sergeant Hand, then he returned the salute. Not showy, not theatrical. Just the economy of a man who did things right or didn't do them at all. The coin under his cap pressed cool against his palm. Staff Sergeant Cole, the judge said, saying the rank as if it were a name in a prayer, saved my life. The words landed heavy and then lighter, a burden and a gift. He saved a lot of lives. He turned, not to the camera that wasn't there, not to the gallery, but to the bailiff, to the clerk, to anyone whose job required them to witness this room every day until faces blurred. He held a perimeter by voice for 7 hours when there was no perimeter left. He got us out of hell 1 meter at a time. The bailiff, the square-shouldered one, had stilled. He brought his hand up too, slow, until it found its position. The defender next to the man made a small sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. The line between those is thinner than you think. Someone in the back wiped at their face quick, as if it were habit. The judge swallowed, reassembled himself, one small piece at a time, and walked back to the bench as if the floor were an uneven ground he needed to test. He put his glasses on, not because he needed them at that exact moment, but because they gave his hands a job. Mr. Cole, he said, voice formal again but cracked at the edges in a way no gavel could smooth. On the matter before the court, he didn't finish that sentence. He didn't have to yet. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of all the words people hadn't said to the man and were saying with their eyes now. The judge cleared his throat. The ordinary weight of the room returned in small increments. The clerk found a pen. The bailiff took one unobtrusive step back to his mark. Public defender recovered herself in a breath. These charges are dismissed, the judge said. The citation is vacated. Mr. Cole, if you will permit it, I will direct Veterans Services to meet you today. We're to assist with housing and benefits. He tapped the file with a finger that trembled only once. You should have been asked long before you had to be summoned. Yes, Your Honor, the man said. We didn't know what to do with a gift like that except not refuse it. It was good at not refusing anything that didn't cost someone else too much. And bailiff, the judge said, not looking away from the man, retrieved Mr. Cole's property from security. The bailiff nodded, glancing at the defender for the where. She whispered, and he disappeared through the door to the hall. The judge picked up his pen, set it down, picked it up again. Court will take a 10-minute recess. His voice had found its old timbre again, but the room had already been changed. All rise. It's this time when they rose, it wasn't just obedience. It had a shape like respect. In the hallway, the young guard from earlier stood by the table of contraband, his mouth a hard line. The bailiff said, "Knife," and the guard reached into the bin, fished out the folded blade, hesitated, hand half open, half closed. The bailiff held his gaze. There are conversations that happen without words between men who have carried— "Wait, you can't see, sir," the guard said when the man approached. He used the word like a swallow, had to help him get it down. "Your knife." His cheeks had gone pink with shame that didn't know where to land. Oh, the man took it without making him tie that shame to anything specific. He clicked the blade open an inch, then closed. Hearing its old homecoming— "I'm sorry," the guard said, but it was addressed to an entire morning, to 100 mornings like it. "Understood," the man said. He never had much use for apologies. That came late. He took them on principle. The bailiff handed him his pack from behind the ficus, intact. The defender hovered, not hovering. "Mr. Cole," she said, "after this, if you're willing, I can help file a claim. It's not charity. It's earned." He nodded once. "Appreciate it." Inside, people were whispering in the way crowds whisper, like a rising wind. The story had already grown legs, walking ahead of the man it was about. "Did you hear? Saved his life. He looks normal. He looks like a person." That last one said more than it knew how to. The judge came back to the bench and handled the next cases with a composure that had a seam in it. When he glanced up, he caught the man's eye through the doorway. There was a small exchange of nods. Something between soldiers, something between citizens, something between two people who had, in different ways, walked home alone from the same distance. When the recess ended and the room filled again, the people who had smirked earlier looked at the floor as if the marble mattered more than air. The young mother pressed her son's hand and whispered something that might have been, "Remember." The courier in the lime jacket stood very still, his jaw tight, as if trying not to swallow what he was feeling in one go. The man didn't soak any of it. He didn't hold the attention like a coat he might want later. He nodded to the defender. "I'll wait for veteran services outside," he said. The defender nodded, eyes bright. "I'll come get you." He put his cap back on, the brim shading a face that was suddenly too seen. The coin settled back into its place, cool against skin. He adjusted the strap on his pack, made sure the knife sat in the side pocket where his hand could find it, and walked toward the doors. He stepped past the young guard, who stepped aside. He stepped past the older one, who couldn't meet his eyes. He stepped past the bench where he'd not been allowed to sit. This time no one told him to move. Outside, the light hit him full in the face. The city had kept right on being itself. During his small uproar, a bus shrugged to the curb. Siren murmured a block away, a sound like someone whistling for help in slow motion. He stood for a second, letting the sun warm the scar under his hairline, letting the heat gather in his bones just enough to loosen the stiff. The defender came out with a man in a polo shirt with the VAS emblem ghosted on it. "Mr. Cole?" the newcomer said. "I'm Eddie." "First, I just want to say no need," the man said, and it was not false modesty. It was exhaustion with praise that comes as currency instead of offering. Eddie took his measure, then pivoted seamlessly. 2 details. Hot meal. A bed for tonight. An appointment tomorrow to begin paperwork. "We can do all that if you want right now." He faced the building one more time. Through the glass, the judge was a small, dark shape under a flag. The man lifted 2 fingers off his cap's brim, something like a goodbye. Then he turned and started to walk toward the corner where the sun made the sidewalk look like water. Slow, but steady, straight, even when the ground underneath was behind him. The shame settled where it needed to, on the cheeks of men who laughed at what they didn't look at, on shoulders of those who watched and said nothing because they thought nothing was better than the wrong thing. Few wiped at their eyes and didn't know why. Respect is a simple language that sounds complicated when you haven't spoken it in a while. He didn't look back. He never had. Some men don't ask for respect. They wear it, quietly, as a discipline. They walk past our indifference the way they walked through weather and noise, insisting less on what they're owed than on what they can carry. But there are names that should make room still. There are postures that deserve more than a glance. Salute the ones who walked alone, who held a line with nothing but their breath and their will so the rest of us wouldn't have to. And when you see them on benches, in doorways, in lines that make everyone ordinary, remember what the judge remembered. Some quiets are not empty. They're full of history that kept you safe.